1 minute, Brigitte.
I thought that the Abbasid Empire and so the king's reality and myth put as a display of power and intellectual movement from Mesopotamia to the Abbasid Empire. Once upon a time in Mesopotamia, you became friends by drinking from the same cup or by sharing salt, a simple ingredient to seal a precious bond, personal or commercial, in contrast with the large banquets of the time. If cuneiform tablets describe their abundance, we still have to discover their menus. In this social system established between reality and imaginary gods and heroes, people bestowed upon the gods full spreads of food, inspired by the royal tables and even more generous. There are many stories related to gods and food in Mesopotamian myth. For instance, the story of Inanna, invited to Eridu to pay a visit to Enki. Upon her arrival, she was offered fresh water, cream, and beer. Later, after sharing many glasses of wine, and when Enki got drunk, Inanna took away some of his power symbols and brought them to Uruk, her city. It is the story of Marduk, who invited the gods to celebrate with him the foundation of Babylon after he tamed the sea. It is another story of the god Enlil, who, wishing to marry Sud, according to the Sumerian myth, at the beginning of the second millennium, sent her parents huge quantity of best quality food as a gift when he got her hand. Or the many stories of the gods called to convene around a meal in order to help humans take major decisions concerning the city. Summoned, they were invited to eat bread and drink beer to facilitate projects, two staple foods introduced by Samkhat to Enkidu in her attempt to civilize him according to the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this same epic, the Inn of Siduri, where food and drinks were served, becomes a symbol that sets the limits to the civilized world. Beyond it, Gilgamesh starts his voyage into unknown territory. Those pampered gods were offered 4 daily meals with a breakfast more varied than the following ones. Composed by different sorts of breads, dried fruits, and other delicacies, gods were mainly fed meat. Let the gods eat roast, 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 proclaimed the cantor. On the same tablet, it is recommended to use a golden dish to serve these roasts. The best products were always given to the gods, as the high priest Kilili reminds Ishtar when he invokes her during a religious ceremony, as he offered her a perfectly cooked young goat à l'ancienne. And even when cooking techniques evolved later, men continued to feed their gods with roasted meats, so they remained happy. Kings and rulers used to invite guests to celebrate important events, such as completion of a building, a military victory, or a visit of a foreign delegation. Along with the meal, beer and wine were served. A trusted servant was in charge of the beverage. The king was always served first, then was the guest he wished to honor. The meals followed a certain ritual, from the scented towels to the meat served with bread and vegetables. On some occasions, freshwater fish could be included, as well as ostrich eggs, mushroom, probably kama, and pistachios. Basic desserts were offered to finish a meal, such as honey-sweetened pastries or fruits. During these banquets, musicians, dancers, actors, and other entertainers performed in front of prestigious guests. Considering himself granted with a divine power to safeguard his people, Sargon of Akkad, around 2350 BC, offered his people's representative and his 5,400 men sumptuous meals on a daily basis. His generosity was so phenomenal that 500 years later, it was still a story told during evening gatherings. In fact, Sargon himself bragged intentionally about his generosity, a reminder of his godly power and the necessity to remain under his authority. Much later, during the Neo-Assyrian period, to celebrate the renovation of his palace in Nimrud, that became the new capital, Assur-Nasirapal II offered to about 70,000 guests a massive meal and continued to supply the inhabitants of the city, the neighboring dignitaries, and the artisans who worked on the project with great food for more than 10 days. During the same period, in the kitchen of the Queen of Nineveh, one could count 400 cooks, 400 bakers, and pastry chefs. All were bustling, cutting wood, cleaning pans and dishes, filling water, lighting fires, and preparing meals. Assisted by 300 servants, 300 chambermaids, and 200 scribes, they were able to accommodate feasts for 16,000 guests. Such a huge crew working in such a large kitchen required a respected hierarchy. There, the Nuchatimo led his brigade, as do the great chefs of today's big restaurants. He approved the dispatch of dishes to which the men in charge of the sauces brought their own touch. These meals were served on displays built by specialized craftsmen. The king ate reclining on a couch, and the presence of the queen sitting on a chair at his feet only as a guest would mark a special event. These palaces would donate the gods daily offerings. Even the Bible mentions memorable meals such as the Balthazar Feast in Babylon before the collapse of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Feast of Xerxes in the Book of Esther. Around that same time in Greece, the stories of the victories and the defeats of Iliad and the Odyssey were recounted. Calypso, obeying Zeus, was getting ready to release Ulysses, her hostage. But before she set him free, they shared a last meal of ambrosia and nectar served by slaves. We still don't know their composition, as the secretive gods kept the recipes exclusively for themselves. Gods, born from within a Greek society where the rich spent fortunes on feasts to honor their guests, where aristocrats also ate reclined on benches with meals served in terracotta dishes or directly in bread before they used it to wipe their finger with, where slaves would serve men first, putting dishes on tables, the heights of which varied according to the occasion. In the cities of ancient Greece, men enjoyed a tradition called the symposium, which finds its origin in military traditions. The symposium functioned as a social aristocratic club with certain values and egalitarian and communal spirit. At that time, any banquet was preceded by a sacrifice, followed by food and drinks. These private reunions were held after a meal and only on specific occasions, whether private or civic. They followed a specific ritual with libation to the gods and singing. Sometimes vows were made, creating a sense of brotherhood that transformed the drinkers into a fraternity. Symposia were meant to either connect to the gods by maintaining a serene atmosphere or simply to offer, through drinking wine, a pleasant environment where dialogue was possible and poetry well received. The gathering would start with each participant drinking a cup of undiluted wine. Then a symposiarch, a banquet king, was designated. He was responsible for the choice of the proper ratios between wine and water, as both were combined, and had to inform the slaves about it. He was the only participant to be allowed to break the rules and to test some participants' ability to drink, asking them to drink more than the others. The first drink was to honor Zeus and the Olympian family. The following drink was to remember the spirit of the heroes, and the third for Zeus Soter. Cheese and bread were offered, allowing the wine to be better absorbed. Reciting poetry was an important part of the gathering, and doing so gave a sense of equality to the group. With time, more and more symposia were held without poetry. Occasionally, courtesans, dancers, musicians, and acrobats were invited. If on one hand there were these magnificent banquets, weddings, and other feasts that defined a certain social class in ancient Greece, on the other hand, there were two currents, the Orphism and the Pythagoreanism, who recommended vegetarian dishes and ascetic practices. Some followers lived mostly on bread and water, others used to deprive themselves of only some foods. On certain occasions, during religious banquets and according to certain rituals, these same followers would eat some meat. Meat became, with time, a major food in ancient Greece athletes' diet, who over time stopped eating desserts and drinking cold water and wine. If wine was the Greeks' favorite drink, it was the Romans too. And if both watered their wine, it was to avoid being seen drunk in public, for drunkenness was socially indecent. In the prominent milieu of merchants and aristocrats, wine complemented banquets. The cellarius in charge of the cellar had to freshen the wine during summer or warm it in winter. He would decant it and often add honey for the first service and infuse it with herbs for the second. Another wine, different wine, was served with desserts. It is not wine, but rather vinegar that Cleopatra used to win a bet she and her lover, the Emperor Mark Antony, had made. The event was first mentioned by Pliny the Elder in his natural history book and was represented in several paintings during the 17th and 18th century. It was found in Italian mansions and on canvases signed by Dutch Golden Age and Flemish Baroque painters. The story says that Mark Antony was bragging about having had the most expensive meal ever. So in order to beat her lover, Cleopatra took off her beautiful, rare, and valuable pearl earring and dropped it into a glass of vinegar. When it was totally dissolved, she drank the most expensive drink ever and won over her lover. And if the Feast of Trimalchio, as described in the Satyricon of Petronius, is a fictional event, it was inspired by the many extravagant meals that became a symbol of decadent Rome. In the Grand Bourgeois, or the aristocratic milieu, dinner was served in a formal reception hall with 3 couches. 3 people could eat in a reclined position on each one of them. The seating of the guests followed a certain hierarchy. The most prominent was placed next to the host. If someone brought a guest, he would be seated behind him. In this elegant lit environment, floors were decorated with mosaic and rooms adorned with fountains, plants, tables, and beds. Tablecloths were first used during the 1st century AD, hence the slaves were no longer required to clean the tables during a meal. Food was served in earthenware dishes inlaid with bronze, silver, or even gold. In the capital of the Roman Empire, that was still at the time a sacrificial culture, there was a big contrast between the smoky and blackened kitchens of ordinary house and the impressive, overcrowded ones of wealthy mansions. Many cooks, busy around the ovens, worked under the order of one chef. Like all great feasts at the time, these banquets usually unfolded into 3 services, and the dishes were announced at the very beginning to the guests. Slaves were required to cut the meat into small bites to allow the guests, all leaning on their left arm, to use their right hand to eat in half-full dishes as required by the strict etiquette. Some of the meals became legendary, such as those prepared by Apicius in the 1st century AD. He never hesitated to bid for a fresh fish at auctions on the harbor, or was ready to sail towards the Libyan shores to purchase special shrimps. The fine gourmet who lived around the most prominent social figures was an unconventional cook who prepared eccentric delicacies with the most exotic ingredients: flamingo tongues, camel hooves, ostrich roast, in order to impress the bourgeois that he used to entertain. His recipes are compiled in 2 books, the first one devoted to sauces, and the other offers a collection of all kinds of recipes listed in 10 different books. Yet, those who did not have the privilege to share the meals cooked by Lucullus or Apicius could have a quick meal sold on the streets blackened by smoke, or grab a meal at wine bars called popinets. Their clients would choose between fried fish, sausages, or ham, a practice that marks the start of the fast food and takeaway industry. Men could also eat at the thermopolium, where a hot meal was served, and visit the prostitutes available in adjacent rooms. A few centuries later, food and cooking had gained increasing importance in the flourishing Abbasid capital, Baghdad. Caliphs and high dignitaries were directly involved in creating new recipes with ingredients they enjoyed. Literature, prose and poetry, cookbooks, and historical documents all attest to the abundant feasts and celebrations. One of the documented events is the wedding of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, Harun al-Rashid's son, with Buran. Banned for a while, the father of the bride threw a memorable wedding for his daughter and the Caliph. He offered valuable gifts to all invited guests. By handling this event the way he did, he not only was organizing the wedding of his daughter to the Caliph, but also securing his social status and his safety. It is during the Abbasid period, and thanks to the taste of Buran, al-Ma'mun's wife, that eggplants made their entrance in kitchen and dishes. Many of these recipes, consigned about 150 years after her death, carry her name. The importance of cooking, the extravagant meals, and abundant food of this era gave rise to a movement called the tatfil, or party crashers. The tfailis, those practicing the tatfil, were the uninvited crashers who would join the party and ate all they could. This tradition, inherited from pre-Islamic times, was also associated to Prophet Muhammad. Story has it that one day a neighbor of the Prophet invited him to share an exceptional stew he had prepared. The Prophet asked him if he could bring Aisha, his favorite wife, but the neighbor refused. The Prophet, who used to preach that he who does not respond to an invitation defies the will of God, and he who comes uninvited is a thief, had to repeat his request 3 times before the host finally accepted. Also considered as the most discreet form of tatfil, some people used to say in the Prophet's surroundings, pretending to memorize verses they already knew just to be able to eat for free. Unlike those, other tfailis would inform their hosts that they would be attending the feast or a picnic, alone or accompanied. Ibn Darraj, a most famous character of tatfil, would even intimidate by threatening that if he could not attend the wedding, he would transform it into a funeral. Compared to a fly landing on food or falling into a glass, the tfaili was also a guest who stayed too long at a host, taking advantage of his generosity. Many stories disclose the various ways and means used by hosts to get rid of an undesired guest who had largely exceeded the limits. However, tatfil was criticized in texts as much as praised. The tfailis were often lovers of food, too stingy to pay the price of the slightest meal. It is said that when asked if they enjoyed eating, their short answer would be na'am, so they did not lose the slightest bit while chewing. As some of the tfailis used to belong to the nobility and were often brilliant and sometimes generous, it would be a true pleasure for the master of the house and his guests to meet them. Those who were gifted musicians would amaze the crowd by their talent. Enchanted, the guests would fall under the spell of a tambourine's rhythm or the melodic tunes of the oud. Some tfailis even managed to marry the host's sister or live with a concubine offered by the master of the house as a reward for their wit and talent. A tfaili was once asked to judge which between 2 desserts, the faludaj or the lauzinej, was the best. After swallowing hastily a bit of one after a piece of the other, he admits to the caliph that he could not make up his mind, and confesses that as soon as he was about to decide on one, the other sweet asked him to reconsider its case. But after having swallowed a dozen of them, the caliph Harun al-Rashid, seeing that his guest was gobbling down the sweets, got angry and threw away the plates. A tfaili such as the elegant poet Bunan was extremely proud of his profession, as he was a party crasher for over 30 years. He took only one apprentice under his wing and taught him how to show up early in order to be well seated, meet the elite, and be served the finest pieces. He recommended to leave before disturbing the host and to remain to the right side of the crowd in order to better monitor the whole party. If he admits that eating with friends is never detrimental to anyone, he speaks with pleasure of his favorite dishes, the madira, the sigbaj, the adasiya, and the faludaj. Connoisseur, as he truly was, he used to advise partygoers on how many bites to take of each dish, when to take more, and how to eat from the dish until some collapsed. Opposing gluttony, the zurafa movement emerged in Baghdad. The movement had started in Syria and the Hijaz within the community of rich traders, and they were then referred to as the refined of Kufa. At first defined by a certain libertinism, scandalous debauchery, and alienated from the religious society, the movement evolved over the centuries. During the Baghdad era, it was mainly centered on the concept of graceful behavior, elegant and detail-oriented clothing, precious jewelry, and as well as a refined choice of food. Eating small bites, they avoided common cuts of meat and animal organs. Watercress, radishes, leeks and onions, beans, oak nuts, and roasted dates were banished from their diet. They only drank the finest wines and sipped it while savoring hazelnuts, pistachio, quinces, or Damascus apples. Witty and warm-hearted, the zurafa avoided to commit bad actions. eager to learn, they knew when to remain silent, selected their acquaintances, and preferred the cultured poor over the uneducated rich. In conclusion, it is clear that since the beginning of civilization, men knew how to discern between consuming food as a means to survive and using it as a tool of power. Banquets and feasts were an early tradition in the Middle East and would serve many purposes. Through these social events, civilized human beings would attempt to appease their gods, and by their generosity, kings and high dignitaries would have a better control over the population of their kingdom. Food would help seal commercial deals and celebrate weddings, impress the rich and honor foreign delegations, as well as celebrate an achievement or simply meet new people. Meals, rich or humble, lavish or simple, contributed to the economical, cultural, social, and political life of an empire. And from these distant times, many dishes became the foundations of our daily food in the Middle East and in Europe. Thank you.
Has to my knowledge not yet arrived, we'll continue and go to the advent of Ottoman times here in the region with Tarek Abu Hussein, who will speak on social dining, banqueting, and the cultivation of a coherent social identity, which connects nicely to especially the closing statement of Brigitte. The case of Damascene ulama in the late Mamluk and early Ottoman period.
I have where's the line?
It's not that important. It's not that basic.